Have you ever looked into your own brother's eyes and realized he was smiling while your entire life was falling apart? Because I have. And the worst part wasn't losing the money. It wasn't the police questioning me. It wasn't even watching my parents believe I was a thief. The worst part was discovering that my brother had planned it all weeks before it happened. My name is Emma Carter. I'm 31 years old, and until last autumn, I believed family was the one thing in life that could never betray you. I grew up in a quiet town outside Portland with my parents, my older brother Daniel, my younger sister Olivia, and my grandmother Evelyn. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable. Dad owned a small accounting firm, Mom worked part-time at the local library, and Grandma had moved in with us after Grandpa passed away. People always told us we were the perfect family. Every Sunday we had dinner together. Every birthday was celebrated. Every holiday ended with laughter around the fireplace. At least, that's what everyone outside our home believed. The truth was far more complicated. Daniel had always been my father's pride. He was the firstborn, the star athlete in high school, the confident one, the son who could do no wrong. If Daniel forgot to call our parents for a week, Dad would laugh and say, "He's busy building his future." If I missed one family dinner because of work, suddenly I didn't care about the family anymore. I learned very early that Daniel and I were judged by different standards. I tried not to resent him. After all, none of that was his fault. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. I became a financial consultant, built a stable career, bought a small townhouse and lived quietly. I wasn't rich, but I paid my bills on time and never asked anyone for help. Daniel's life looked even more successful. He owned a construction company, drove a luxury SUV, lived in a beautiful house with his wife Rebecca. Whenever people spoke about him, they used words like successful, ambitious, and self-made. Looking back now, I realize appearances can be the biggest lie of all. The dinner that changed everything happened on the first Sunday in October. Mom had spent the entire day cooking. The smell of roast chicken and fresh bread filled the house before I even walked through the front door. Grandma hugged me tightly. "You're too skinny," she said with a smile. "You always say that." Because it's always true. For a little while, everything felt normal. Olivia arrived carrying homemade cheesecake. Daniel and Rebecca came 20 minutes later. Daniel hugged Dad. Rebecca kissed Mom on the cheek. They looked like the perfect couple. Confident, relaxed, happy. If someone had taken a family photograph right then, no one would have guessed that within 2 hours, our family would be destroyed. Dinner started with jokes and old memories. Dad told the same fishing story he'd been telling for 15 years. Olivia rolled her eyes. Grandma laughed anyway. Even Daniel seemed unusually cheerful. He kept filling everyone's glasses. He complimented Mom's cooking 3 different times. He even apologized for missing the previous month's dinner. It all felt almost too perfect. Halfway through dessert, Dad cleared his throat. "I have something important to tell everyone." The room became quiet. "I've decided it's time to organize our estate properly." Mom nodded. "We've been putting it off for years." Dad continued. "Tomorrow morning, I'm meeting with our solicitor to move our savings into a family trust." He looked around the table before adding, "Until the paperwork is complete, the money is still in the home safe." No one said anything. Dad smiled. "It's just temporary. There are about £400,000 inside." I nearly choked on my coffee. He looked around the table before adding, "Until the paperwork is complete, the money is still in the home safe." No one said anything. Dad smiled. "It's just temporary. There are about £400,000 inside." I nearly choked on my coffee. I had no idea my parents had saved that much. Grandma smiled proudly. 40 years of careful planning. Dad laughed. And saying no to expensive holidays. Everyone smiled. Everyone except Daniel. It lasted less than 2 seconds. But I noticed it. The moment Dad mentioned the amount, Daniel's smile disappeared. His eyes locked onto the office door. Then, just as quickly, he smiled again. At the time I ignored it. Now, I wish I hadn't. About 20 minutes later, Rebecca accidentally spilled red wine across the front of my cream-colored sweater. "Oh my goodness," she gasped. "I'm so sorry." She grabbed a handful of napkins before I could even react. It'll stain if we don't clean it now. Mom insisted I change into one of her spare sweaters upstairs. I left my handbag beside the dining table and hurried to the bathroom. Rebecca followed me halfway up the stairs. I feel terrible, she kept saying. It was an accident. It's fine, I replied. Don't worry about it. She smiled. I'll bring you another towel. I thanked her without thinking. It never crossed my mind that she wasn't helping me. She was making sure my handbag stayed downstairs without me. About 10 minutes later, I returned to the dining room. Nothing looked unusual. Everyone was laughing again. My handbag was exactly where I'd left it. Or so I thought. But sometimes, the most dangerous changes are the ones you can't see. Dinner continued for another hour. We talked about Christmas plans. Olivia showed Grandma pictures from a recent trip. Dad opened an old photo album. For a while, it felt like one of those evenings I'd remember forever. I just didn't know. I'd remember it for all the wrong reasons. Then, at exactly 9:07 p.m., Dad excused himself to grab some paperwork from his office before everyone left. Less than a minute later, we heard something crash. A loud bang echoed through the hallway. Mom jumped to her feet. Derek. No answer. Then Dad's voice filled the house. It wasn't angry. It wasn't loud. It was something much worse. It was fear. My God. The safe. It's empty. The entire room froze. For a moment, nobody moved. Dad stood frozen in the doorway of his office, gripping the door frame as if his legs could no longer hold him. Mom rushed toward him. Derek. What's wrong? Dad slowly stepped aside. The safe door hung wide open. Inside, it was empty. The thick brown envelopes that had held nearly 400,000 pounds were gone. Mom covered her mouth. Oh my God. Dad looked around the room with panic in his eyes. No. No. This isn't possible. Olivia hurried into the office and stared at the empty shelves. Grandma remained standing in the hallway, holding onto her walking stick. Her face had turned pale. Daniel walked in last. He looked inside the safe, then slowly shook his head. This has to be some kind of mistake. Dad turned toward him. There is no mistake. I checked the money yesterday. It was all here. The room filled with anxious voices. Did someone break in? Were the locks damaged? Should we call the police? Dad quickly examined the office window. Still locked. Nothing was broken. Nothing had been forced open. Whoever had taken the money hadn't needed to break in. They already had access. A terrible silence settled over the room. Dad looked from one face to another. Nobody leaves. I need everyone to stay exactly where they are. No one argued. Not even Daniel. He simply folded his arms and watched everyone carefully. Then he asked a question that seemed innocent at the time. Who went near the office tonight? Everyone looked at each other. Mom shook her head. I've been in the kitchen most of the evening. Olivia shrugged. I only came down the hallway to use the bathroom. Grandma quietly said. I haven't left the living room. Then Daniel slowly turned toward me. I saw Emma near Dad's office. Every eye in the room shifted toward me. I frowned. I walked past it. That's all. You were gone for several minutes, Daniel replied calmly. I went upstairs to change because Rebecca spilled wine on me. Rebecca nodded immediately. That's true. She sounded supportive. Almost too supportive. But after you came back downstairs. She tilted her head slightly. I didn't see you for a while. I stared at her. What are you talking about? I was sitting right here. She gave a small shrug. I'm just saying I didn't notice. It was such a simple sentence. Yet somehow, it planted the first seed of doubt. Dad rubbed his forehead. I don't want to accuse anyone. But someone in this house took that money. Mom whispered. Maybe we should search the house. No one objected. We all began checking every room. Bedrooms, closets, kitchen cupboards, even the garage. Nothing. It was as if 400,000 pounds had simply disappeared into thin air. Then, Rebecca looked toward the dining table. Should we check everyone's bags? The room fell silent. I blinked. My bag. She smiled awkwardly. Just so everyone knows we're being fair. Olivia frowned. Rebecca, is that really necessary? Daniel answered before she could. If everyone's innocent, no one should have a problem with it. Dad hesitated, then slowly nodded. I hate doing this. But he's right. One by one, we opened our handbags, jackets, and coats. Olivia emptied her purse onto the table. Grandma opened her knitting bag. Mom unzipped her handbag. Nothing. Then Daniel picked up mine. I reached for it instinctively. I'll do it. He smiled politely. It's okay. I've got it. Something about that moment still haunts me. The confidence in his eyes. Almost as if he already knew what he was about to find. He unzipped my handbag, slipped his hand inside, then suddenly stopped. His expression changed. Slowly, he pulled out a thick brown envelope, exactly like the ones Dad kept inside the safe. Nobody spoke. Daniel reached inside again. Another envelope, then another, then another. 5 envelopes, filled with cash. The room exploded. Mom gasped so loudly she nearly collapsed. Dad stumbled backwards into his desk. Olivia stared at me in complete shock. Grandma whispered, "No. No." I couldn't even breathe. My mind refused to accept what I was seeing. Those envelopes had never been in my bag. They couldn't have been. I didn't put those there. My voice cracked. I swear. I've never seen them before. Daniel looked at me with what appeared to be heartbreak. Emma. Why? I stared at him in disbelief. What? If you needed money, you could have asked us. I felt my anger rising. I didn't take it. Rebecca wrapped an arm around Mom. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. I can't believe this. Her performance was flawless. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed her too. Dad slowly walked toward me. His hands were shaking. Emma, tell me honestly, did you do this? The question shattered something inside me. Not because he asked it, but because I realized he genuinely believed I might say yes. Tears filled my eyes. Dad, I would never steal from you. You know me. He looked down at the envelopes, then back at me. I thought I did. Those 5 words broke my heart. Before I could speak again, Daniel quietly took out his phone. I'm calling the police. I grabbed his arm. No. He pulled away. If you're innocent, you've got nothing to fear. 5 minutes later, blue lights flashed through the front windows. 2 police officers stepped into the house. And as they introduced themselves, I realized my nightmare had only just begun. The flashing blue lights reflected across my parents' living room windows. For the first time in my life, police officers weren't arriving to help me. They were arriving because everyone believed I had stolen from my own family. The front door opened. 2 officers stepped inside. The older one introduced himself. I'm Detective Michael Mason. The younger officer nodded politely. Officer Sarah Reed. Dad took a deep breath before speaking. I believe someone has stolen nearly £400,000 from my home safe. Detective Mason glanced at the envelopes on the dining table. And you found part of the money? Dad nodded. In my daughter's handbag. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me again. Detective Mason looked directly at me. Miss Carter, would you mind telling me your side of the story? My throat felt dry. I didn't steal anything. I have no idea how that money ended up in my bag. He didn't interrupt. He simply listened. When I finished, he wrote a few notes before asking, did anyone else have access to your handbag tonight? Yes. I left it beside the dining table while I went upstairs to change my sweater. How long was it unattended? Around 10 minutes. He nodded slowly. 10 minutes is enough time. For the first time that evening, someone had admitted it was possible. Daniel quickly stepped forward. But why would anyone frame Emma? It doesn't make any sense. Detective Mason looked at him calmly. Sometimes it doesn't. And sometimes it makes perfect sense. We don't assume anything until we've examined every possibility. Daniel forced a smile. Of course. But the money was still found in her bag. It was, the detective replied. But evidence tells us where something was found. It doesn't always tell us how it got there. I noticed something strange. For just a split second, Daniel looked uncomfortable. It disappeared almost immediately. But I saw it. The officers photographed every envelope. Then they counted the cash. 2, 3, 5 envelopes. Dad frowned. There should be 20. Detective Mason looked up. So only 1/4 of the money has been recovered. That meant £300,000 was still missing. The detective slowly looked around the room. So whoever took the money still has most of it. A heavy silence followed. One by one, everyone gave a statement. Mom explained she'd been cooking almost the entire evening. Olivia described helping set the table. Grandma admitted she hadn't left her chair because her knees had been hurting. Then it was Daniel's turn. He spoke confidently, almost too confidently. I arrived around 6. We had dinner. I saw Emma walking near Dad's office after dessert. And later, I watched her pick up her handbag. That's all. Detective Mason looked at him. You never entered the office? No. You never went near the safe? No. You remained with the family all evening? Yes. His answers came quickly, without hesitation, almost rehearsed. Rebecca gave a statement next. First, it matched Daniel's perfectly, almost word for word. Too perfectly. She even repeated the same phrases. I noticed Emma acting nervous. I saw her disappear. I assumed she was upstairs. Detective Mason quietly closed his notebook, then asked a simple question. Mrs. Carter, what color was Emma's sweater before the wine was spilled? Rebecca blinked. Blue. I frowned. It hadn't been blue. It had been cream. Detective Mason smiled politely. And after she changed? Rebecca hesitated. White. Wrong again. I'd borrowed one of Mom's dark green sweaters. The detective wrote something down. Rebecca's cheeks turned slightly red. Daniel quickly interrupted. She probably just forgot. Detective Mason nodded. Perhaps. But I could tell. He'd noticed the inconsistency. So had I. The officer spent the next hour searching the entire house. Every bedroom. Every cupboard. Every drawer. Nothing. No trace of the missing £300,000. No hidden bags. No suspicious footprints. Nothing. As they prepared to leave, Detective Mason turned to my father. We're not making an arrest tonight. Dad looked surprised. But the money? We don't have enough evidence. The investigation is just beginning. Then he looked at me. Miss Carter, I'd advise you not to leave town until we've completed our investigation. I nodded quietly. I understand. The police finally left. The house became painfully silent again. I looked at my parents. Neither of them would meet my eyes. Mom quietly gathered the coffee cups. Dad sat alone in the living room staring into space. It felt as though I'd already been convicted. Without a trial. Without proof. Without anyone truly listening. I picked up my coat. I think I should go. No one stopped me. Not even Dad. As I reached the front door, his voice stopped me. Soft. Broken. I never imagined that one of my children would do this. I turned around with tears running down my face. I didn't. I promise you. For a second, I thought he might believe me, and said, he slowly looked away. That hurt more than the accusation itself. I sat inside my car for nearly 20 minutes before driving home. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I kept replaying every moment of the evening. The dinner. The wine. The handbag. The envelopes. Then suddenly, one memory hit me like lightning. Rebecca. When she'd spilled the wine, she had insisted on following me upstairs. But halfway up, she'd said, you go ahead. I'll grab another towel. She never actually came upstairs. She had turned around, gone back downstairs, where my handbag had been sitting, completely unguarded. I grabbed my phone and opened the family group chat. Olivia had posted several photos from dinner earlier that evening. I started zooming into each one. Nothing. Then, the fourth photo. Everyone was smiling around the table. But in the background, 2 chairs were empty. Daniel's. And Rebecca's. The timestamp was 8:34 p.m. For nearly 3 minutes. Neither of them had been at the table. No one had noticed, because everyone had been looking at Grandma as she told one of Grandpa's old stories. A chill ran down my spine. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't looking for the wrong person. Maybe I'd trusted the wrong brother my entire life. The next morning I couldn't focus on anything. I hadn't slept for more than an hour. Every time I closed my eyes I heard my father's voice. "I thought I knew you." Those words hurt more than the accusation itself. At around 10 o'clock my phone rang. The screen showed an unfamiliar number. "Miss Carter." "Yes. This is Detective Mason." My heart started pounding. "We've completed the first round of interviews. I'd like you to come to your parents' house." "Why?" "We've discovered something you need to see." When I arrived, the driveway was already full of police vehicles. Dad stood outside with his arms folded. He barely looked at me. Mom's eyes were swollen from crying. Olivia gave me a small, nervous smile. Daniel and Rebecca were standing together near the front door. Daniel looked unusually calm. Too calm. As if he believed the worst was already over. Detective Mason led everyone into the living room. "We've learned that Mr. Carter's home has 4 exterior security cameras." Dad frowned. "I completely forgot about them. They were installed 2 years ago after the neighbor's house was robbed." Detective Mason nodded. "Unfortunately, nobody mentioned them last night." Daniel immediately spoke. "They only cover outside. They won't show what happened inside." The detective looked at him carefully. "Perhaps. But they may show something equally important." A laptop was connected to the television. Officer Reed inserted a flash drive. The footage began. The timestamp showed 7:41 p.m. Everyone watched in complete silence. The front camera showed family members arriving. Nothing unusual. The side camera showed Olivia carrying dessert. The garage camera showed Daniel parking his SUV. Everything looked perfectly normal. For nearly 15 minutes. Nothing happened. Daniel leaned back on the sofa. "I told you. This won't prove anything." Detective Mason ignored him. He fast-forwarded. The timestamp changed to 8:28 p.m. The side entrance camera showed me walking upstairs after Rebecca spilled the wine. I disappeared from view. My handbag remained on the dining chair inside the open patio door. You couldn't see the bag clearly, but you could see everyone walking past it. Then, Rebecca entered the frame. She stopped, looked around, checked over both shoulders. Daniel appeared a few seconds later. Instead of walking inside, he positioned himself directly in front of the patio door, blocking the view from anyone inside the dining room. My stomach tightened. "What is he doing?" Olivia whispered. Nobody answered. The footage continued. Rebecca bent down near the chair where my handbag had been left. Because of Daniel's position, the camera couldn't show exactly what she was doing, but she remained there for almost 15 seconds. Then she stood up, smiled, and casually walked back toward the kitchen. Daniel followed a few moments later. The room fell silent. Detective Mason paused the video. He looked at Daniel. "Can you explain this?" Daniel shrugged. "I was talking to my wife. Near Emma's handbag? It was just a coincidence." Rebecca quickly nodded. "I was looking for napkins." Olivia suddenly frowned. "That's strange." Everyone looked at her. "You asked me for napkins 5 minutes earlier. I handed you a whole stack." Rebecca's face lost a little color. I forgot." No one believed that answer. Detective Mason didn't argue. He simply pressed play again. The footage jumped ahead to 8:44 p.m. Dad was giving a short speech in the dining room. Everyone appeared to be listening. Then, Officer Reed suddenly leaned closer to the screen. "Stop." The image froze. He zoomed in on the reflection in the patio glass. It was blurry, but not impossible to understand. A man was walking down the hallway leading to Dad's office. The figure couldn't be identified by face, but one detail stood out. A silver wristwatch, with a dark blue dial. Grandma gasped. "I know that watch." Dad slowly turned toward Daniel. "It was my retirement gift." Grandma nodded. "I bought it for him last Christmas." Every eye moved to Daniel's wrist. He was still wearing it. The exact same watch. Daniel instinctively pulled his sleeve down. Too late. Officer Reed enlarged the reflection again. The watch matched perfectly. Detective Mason quietly closed his notebook. Mr. Carter, yesterday you stated under caution that you never walked toward your father's office. Daniel swallowed. I must have forgotten. You forgot. Yes. It was a stressful evening. Detective Mason looked directly into his eyes. Interesting. Because people usually forget insignificant details. They rarely forget entering the room where £400,000 disappeared. Nobody spoke. Even Rebecca looked nervous now. For the first time, Daniel wasn't controlling the conversation. He was trying to survive it. The detective continued reviewing the recordings. Then Officer Reed noticed something strange. Sir, the system log shows a recording gap. Detective Mason frowned. What kind of gap? 6 minutes of footage have been deleted. The room froze. Dad looked shocked. Deleted. Officer Reed nodded slowly. Not corrupted. Deleted manually. Then he looked at Daniel. According to the system settings, the last person to access this recorder used the administrator password. Dad blinked. Only 2 people know that password. Me and Daniel. For the first time since this nightmare began, Daniel's confidence completely disappeared. A single bead of sweat rolled down the side of his face, and Detective Mason quietly said, I think we've just found the beginning of the truth. The room fell into complete silence. No one looked away from Daniel. Even he couldn't hide the panic on his face anymore. Detective Mason folded his arms. Mr. Carter, would you like to explain why 6 minutes of security footage were manually deleted? Daniel forced a nervous laugh. I don't know anything about deleted footage. I haven't touched that system in months. Officer Reed shook her head. Actually, the security recorder logs every login. She turned the laptop toward everyone. The administrator account was accessed yesterday afternoon. The login came from your mobile phone. Daniel's eyes widened. That's impossible. Officer Reed clicked another screen. No. It's very possible. The recorder is connected to your father's home Wi-Fi. At 3:17 p.m., someone logged into the system using your saved administrator password. She paused. Your phone was connected to the same network at exactly the same time. Dad slowly looked at his son. You told me you stopped by yesterday to borrow my ladder. Daniel nodded weakly. I did. You were here less than 10 minutes. Officer Reed replied quietly. 10 minutes was more than enough. Rebecca suddenly stepped forward. You're making assumptions. Detective Mason remained calm. No, Mrs. Carter. We're following evidence. And the evidence is beginning to point in one direction. Then Officer Reed smiled. I've managed to recover part of the deleted footage. Everyone turned toward the television. The damaged video flickered onto the screen. Static lines rolled across the image. Then, the picture became clear. The timestamp read 8:37 p.m. The hallway outside Dad's office appeared. Daniel quietly walked into the office. He looked over both shoulders before closing the door behind him. 30 seconds later, Rebecca entered the hallway. Instead of following him, she stood outside the office like she was keeping watch. She checked both directions several times. Then Olivia's laughter echoed from the dining room. Rebecca immediately smiled and walked back as if nothing had happened. Another minute passed. Daniel came out carrying a small black pouch. He slipped it inside his jacket. The video froze. Detective Mason looked at Daniel. What was inside that pouch? Daniel didn't answer. What was in it? Silence. Dad's voice cracked. Daniel, please. If there's something I don't know, tell me now. Daniel lowered his head. His shoulders began to shake. For a moment, I thought he was crying, and said, he laughed. A short, broken, hopeless laugh. It was over before it even started. Rebecca whispered, Daniel. He ignored her. Then he looked at our father. You always wanted me to be perfect. I spent my whole life trying. Dad frowned. What are you talking about? My company. It's finished. The room went silent. I owe suppliers over £280,000. The bank was about to repossess everything. I was days away from bankruptcy. Mom covered her mouth. You never told us. Daniel laughed bitterly. How could I? You've spent your entire lives telling everyone I was the successful son. I couldn't admit I'd failed. He looked at me. And then I found out Emma had been promoted. She was earning more than me. Everyone started talking about how responsible she was. I couldn't stand it anymore. I stared at him in disbelief. So you framed me? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, Rebecca spoke. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Every head turned toward her. Tears streamed down her face. It was my idea. Daniel looked shocked. Rebecca. No. She shook her head. I'm done lying. She looked directly at Detective Mason. I told Daniel his parents would never suspect Emma. I knew her handbag would be left alone if I spilled the wine. I bought envelopes identical to the ones your father used. I hid 5 bundles in her bag. So everyone would stop looking for the rest. The room erupted. Mom burst into tears. Olivia stepped backwards in horror. Dad closed his eyes. He looked as though the weight of the world had fallen onto his shoulders. Detective Mason spoke softly. And the remaining money? Rebecca pointed toward the ceiling. The attic. We hid it behind the false panel inside the new fireproof cabinet. Officer Reed immediately went upstairs with another officer. 5 minutes later, she returned carrying the missing envelopes. Every single pound was there. Not one bundle had been spent. Dad stared at the recovered money. Then he looked at me. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he walked across the room. His eyes were filled with tears. I'm sorry. I failed you. I couldn't hold back anymore. I hugged him as tightly as I could. For the first time in 2 days, I cried. Not because I was hurt, but because my father finally believed me. Behind us, Detective Mason placed handcuffs on Daniel and Rebecca. As they were led toward the front door, Daniel stopped beside me. Without looking into my eyes, he whispered, I never hated you. I hated the person I'd become. I didn't answer. Some apologies come too late. I watched as the police car disappeared down the street. The brother I'd grown up with, the one who taught me how to ride a bike, the one who used to protect me from school bullies, was gone. In his place stood a man who had chosen greed over family. The months that followed weren't easy. Daniel pleaded guilty to fraud, theft, and attempting to pervert the course of justice. Rebecca accepted a plea agreement after cooperating with investigators. Both received prison sentences. Dad sold the construction equipment Daniel had left behind to help repay his business creditors. But he refused to excuse what his son had done. Our family dinners stopped for nearly a year. Not because we didn't love each other. Because healing takes time. One Sunday, almost 12 months later, Grandma invited all of us back to the same dining table. Only 4 chairs were occupied this time. Dad looked at me before we started eating. I spent years believing trust came from blood. He smiled sadly. I was wrong. Trust comes from character. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Some families are broken forever by betrayal. Ours survive. Not because we ignored the truth, but because we finally faced it. And if there's one lesson I learned from losing everything for a few terrifying days, it's this. Sometimes the people who shout the loudest about loyalty are the very ones hoping you'll never question theirs. The end. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments. What would you have done if your own brother had framed you? Your thoughts might be featured in the next story.